Good morning, Happy New Year. I'm Mark Dober, Managing Director of Dober Partners. I'm joined today on this webinar with Sophie Mize and Sylvie Dumortier, working with Clayton Engels, and they're going to talk to you about the HR, legal and tax implications of being an association leader here in Belgium. Just a few words about Dober Partners to start with. So in our team of 8 people, we have 4 former Secretaries General of European Trade Associations, 3 former heads of communications, and a Chief Operating Officer of European Association. So hopefully we know a thing or two about association leadership, and we've got direct experience of advising and recruiting association leaders over many years. So I wish you Happy New Year, and I'm looking forward to this new year getting going because let's face it, 2020 was not the best, was it? It started with fires in Australia and ended up with typhoons in the Pacific. And we had that little thing called COVID to deal with. And it wasn't a great year for many trade associations here in Brussels who had to deal with hardship amongst their members, the stress of home working and a new environment. And also, congresses and events were cancelled, which in many cases led to a drop in income. So it wasn't a great year, but 2021 is looking to be much better. I'm really looking forward to Donald Trump leaving office in the coming days. It's great that Brexit is finally behind us. I'm looking forward to seeing what Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are going to do to re-engage the United States with the rest of the world. The EU's looking in good shape and has agreed a long-term budget, and the vaccines are coming. So I think there's lots to be cheerful about this year, globally and in Brussels. And when we look at the European Trade Association environment, one thing that I've observed over the last year is that corporates particularly have become very appreciative of trade association memberships. In fact, when we did a discrete piece of research of around 80 people involved with corporate affairs, public affairs, regulatory affairs, involved with European trade associations, not just in Brussels, but around Europe, we asked them a simple question, has your membership of trade associations become less important, the same, more important than before the crisis? And we got an overwhelming affirmation. In fact, 70% of them said that their trade association membership has become more important or much more important than before COVID. That's hardly surprising when you think about it, because companies and whole sectors have needed to engage with the EU and with member state governments in a way that they never had to before. So perhaps now is a good time to ask for a pay rise. So money doesn't always buy you love, doesn't always buy you happiness. In fact, some people have studied how much money do you need to be happy. I've seen a study by Gallup and Purdue University, which actually put a number of around 100,000 euros on peak happiness. And in fact, noted that after that point, you can actually see some declines in happiness, perhaps with additional stress, responsibilities or whatever go with having more money. Perhaps that number is a little bit higher in Belgium, where we have to pay such high taxes. I don't know what that number is, but the interesting thing is that when we asked you, people working in trade associations last year, so during the crisis, are you happy in your job? 77% said they're either happy or very happy, which is incredible. It's actually it's the reverse of other surveys that we see in the general workforce globally. So I've seen surveys of white collar workers which say that 70 to 80% are actually unhappy in their jobs. So lucky you if you work in a European Trade Association, because what researchers have found is that what really creates happiness beyond having a certain amount of income is having purpose in your job. And I think people who work in associations really have a shared common sense of purpose, representing sectors and companies, and they know that their work makes a real difference to people's lives. So, talking about our report, we conducted a survey in May and June of last year. We got 410 responses from people working in 536 European trade associations, which is a huge response. And 150 of those were actually association leaders. So people like you on this webinar at the Secretary General level. So 150 out of 536 is a very representative sample. It's something like 30%. And if you were to transfer that to a proportion, for instance, of the Belgian population, that would be like getting survey responses from 3.5 million people. So we're very sure of the data. The data is good, and it was interesting to do analysis of the titles and the functions. And as you can see, we noted 12 key functions, and we give breakdowns and detailed information on 8 of those functions. While we're talking about title, one thing that I was interested to observe was the prevalence of the title Secretary General. Some of you may have read my report some years ago, Key Success Factors for European Associations, which I first published back in 2013, and I hope to do an update of that later this year. But back then, what I did notice was there was a bit of a trend of Secretaries General becoming Directors General or Chief Executives. For instance, in Business Europe, the Secretary General became a Director General. And I think that was in line with certain members who wanted their Secretary General to direct rather than perhaps the inference of a secretary of note-taking. And some Secretary General wanted to be peers with their members who were chief executives themselves. So sometimes we see Chief Executive Officer as a title used here in Brussels. But it's interesting to see Secretary General is still the #1 title. And hey, I mean, Secretary General is an important title. Look at the Secretary General of the United Nations, the Secretary General of the European Commission, etc. I've often asked, as a headhunter in Brussels, what kind of salary should I expect in the market? And what I've observed over the years is that there's a tremendous variation in salaries in Brussels, and there's not always a clear logic to it. If you're a good negotiator, that might help, and gender does seem to have a role, unfortunately, certainly in the salaried association leader segment, where we did notice on average 20,000 euros less for women. It's a very complex subject, which I'm not going to get into now. Happy to take questions on, and I do write about it in the report. But I do want to highlight now 4 key factors. Firstly, the salary history. So clearly, when we're recruiting a new Secretary General for a particular job, what he or she is going to be paid will be determined in large part by what was the budget for the previous Secretary General, especially in an environment where budgets tend to be relatively static or low growing. The size of the association can have an impact. So if they have a large secretariat or it's a wealthy industry or sector, lots of members, then that can also lead to higher salaries, but not always, and there's not always a clear line there. Impact of EU regulation would tend to indicate high salaries. So, for instance, anything to do with human health, whether it be pharmaceuticals or tobacco, would tend to lead to higher salaries. And lastly, and most importantly for our discussion today, the tax arrangements. So whether the Secretary General is paid as an independent or as a salaried employee. So we divided our research into 2 parts for association leaders. Firstly, we looked at salaried leaders and then independents. And overall, what I'd like to note here is that we found around 70% are salaried employees and 30% are independent contractors, which actually is a larger proportion of independents than when I last did this research some years ago, when it was around 25%. So there's definitely a growth in that group. And I think, what's the reason? I think it's the social security, and it's the savings and tax savings that can be attributed to the leader, him or herself, but also potentially to the association itself. So looking at a salaried segment, around a fifth earn less than 100,000 euros. I think it's fair to say that some people in that group are working part-time, and it's a small group, And some of them are also working in consultancies where perhaps they're a little bit younger, less experienced, and they are housing several associations within one company, and perhaps there's one person leading a trade association, a smaller one. But most people earn between 100,000 and 200,000 euros per annum. And then a fifth earn more than that. And there are indeed people earning more than 300 and even 400,000 euros in Brussels. I know because we've been involved in their recruitment. Now, those are good numbers, but clearly they're not as high as one sees elsewhere, notably Washington. I was amazed last time I went to DC a couple of years ago. We work with Dober Partners over there, and they were telling us that association leaders can earn $1, $2, $3, even $5 million per year. So a very different pay scale over there. It's fair to say that associations do not have a large bonus culture. Again, this is hardly surprising in a sort of fixed fee type of environment where there's stable income growth. It's a very different environment in companies which can grow quickly. And for instance, in some of our corporate affairs positions, bonuses are typically around 15-20%, but we've even recruited people who earn 70% or 100% of their annual income as bonus. There you can see how it's divided, but around 40% of those surveyed have no bonus whatsoever, and 13% don't really have a meaningful bonus. I think it's only considered a meaningful bonus over 5%. When we look at benefits for salaried employees, certain elements one might consider standard. So chèque repas, pension, smartphone, private healthcare, those are all standard issue benefits, and you can see them at the top of the graph. The ones at the bottom of the graph are unusual, and they include things like training allowances, warrants, which Sophie's going to talk about, and Sylvie, as there may be some new changes coming there, bicycle allowance, and gym memberships. So they do exist, but they're definitely in the minority. I was also interested in the have-nots as well as the haves, and I noted here 40% do not have an association car, which is surprising. Around a third of white-collar workers in Belgium do have a company car, so it's surprising to see that senior people running associations don't always have a car. 30% don't have a representation allowance at all. This is the tax-free, social security-free allowance that you should certainly be entitled to have as a Secretary General of a trade association. It's what you're supposed to do. It's supposed to represent your sector. I was also surprised to see that a fifth claim less than 150 euros. I think you might want a second opinion from your accountant on that number, because certainly I'm advised by experts that it would be quite normal to have around 300 euros, let's say, for a Secretary General representing a European Trade Association. And in this environment where we're all working from home at the moment, offices are closed, it's surprising to see that 60% of association leaders are not claiming home internet allowance, which is clearly a business or association expense these days. When we look at independents, the overall income tends to be quite higher. I think the average is around 190,000 for independents. Part of the reason they are independents is they are more expensive, and if they were to be salaried employees, then clearly the cost, including social security, to the association would be immense. So if you compare independents, 40% earn over 200,000, whereas it's only 20% earn over 200,000 for salaried employees. So they tend to be more at the top end, but interestingly, their bonuses, similarly, they're not earning huge bonuses, and a lot of them aren't earning any bonuses at all. So I'd just like to conclude actually by a slide from some other research I did not so long ago on high performance secretariats, and we asked 300 people involved with trade associations, what are the key elements for rewarding high performance individuals? And you can see to the right there of that graph, not so important, to the left, very important. So the one ones at the top are the most important, and flexibility, this is a few years ago, was clearly number one, and that I think has just become reinforced by the situation we find ourselves in today, and confirmed by studies, for instance, done by Manpower Group, which was done globally, where they said almost 94% of workers are concerned about going back to the workplace, and when they do go back to the workplace, they expect a more flexible work schedule, and they expect more and better work-life balance going forward. And we talked about non-financial motivations, new responsibilities, recognition, flexible working locations, training opportunities, etc. These are all things to consider as you're negotiating with your staff in January and February in terms of keeping them motivated for another challenging year ahead. So thank you for your attention, and at this point I will hand over to Sophie Mice.